We have now Elizabeth Milner outside of the federal courthouse.
It started like any other day in court, but everyone could feel it was different. The air had a strange weight to it, like something was coiled. Just out of sight, ready to snap, Sean Diddy Combs walked in through the side door like he always did. Flanked by his legal team, suited and muted, gray head up, but something about him looked off, not panicked, not afraid, just unsettled. His eyes scanned the room a little longer than usual, pausing briefly on the jury box, then over at the prosecution's table. They weren't looking back at him. That was the first signal. They weren't posturing, weren't preparing. They were waiting, calm, silent, like hunters who already knew the animal was cornered. The judge entered. 5 minutes later, no small talk, no half. Smiles, just a nod to the clerk, a glance at both tables, and a few quiet words that made the entire gallery lean forward. This session will begin with a motion submitted under seal defense. I trust you've reviewed the materials as instructed. Diddy's lead attorney stood visibly thrown off. Your Honor, we received a digital notice late last night, but we were under the impression. The judge cut him off. Impressions don't override deadlines. The prosecution may proceed. The entire room shifted, not dramatically, but precisely the kind of shift that happens when everyone in the room except one man knows what's coming. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable video, make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way, you'll never miss any new coming videos like this. Now let's get back to it. A cart was wheeled in with a mounted screen facing the jury. No witness took the stand. No new face entered, just the screen and a black USB drive inserted by a court technician. Under the judge's nod, the lights dimmed slightly, the screen flickered, and then the first line of text appeared, dated, time-stamped, encrypted, origin traced to a device listed under a foreign corporate shell once tied to Diddy's music label subsidiary. The line read, "If this gets out, we're finished." No context, no sender, just that the courtroom didn't react at first. They didn't need to, because all eyes, every single one, were now fixed on Diddy. He didn't blink, but he didn't breathe either. Another message appeared, then another. A thread of conversations between anonymous accounts, each with careful phrasing, vague references, and time tags that lined up with moments already brought up in testimony. The names were redacted, but the intent wasn't. The messages didn't scream guilt. They whispered something worse: planning, strategy, cover-up. Diddy's attorney rose to object. Citing unclear authentication, the prosecution handed over the blockchain verification receipts and international verification stamps. The judge accepted them into the sealed record without pause. By this point, Diddy's posture had changed. He wasn't leaning back anymore. He was sitting forward, one hand on his chin, eyes locked on the screen, like he was scanning every line for something familiar, something he hoped wasn't there. The next message hit harder. It was shorter, sharper, more specific. Shut it down before the feds ask questions. That was it. The room held its breath, and he didn't flinch, but he no longer looked confident. He looked like a man staring at something he thought was buried, something that had just clawed its way back to the surface. The courtroom wasn't moving, but the energy inside it was shifting fast, like the room itself had suddenly turned into a tunnel, pulling everything toward one inescapable point. The screen kept flashing message after message, each one more precise, more surgical. They weren't threats, they were instructions. A time-stamped log showed a conversation referencing an external contractor being paid in full offshore. The defense team scrambled. One lawyer whispered furiously to another, shaking her head. Another grabbed a legal pad and started writing in all caps. Diddy didn't look at them. He was still watching the screen, jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle twitching in his cheek. Then came the line that cracked the silence wide open. Same night, same name, package moved, no leaks. The courtroom froze. The prosecution didn't explain. They didn't need to. The jury had already heard testimony days earlier about that same night, about a missing security footage file, about a guest list that had one name removed the morning after. Now it all had context. One juror visibly recoiled. Another took a slow breath, like they were processing just how deep this thing really went, and across the room the judge sat still, expression unreadable but no longer casual. He was leaning forward now, elbows on the bench, fingers laced, eyes narrowed directly on Diddy. The defense objected. Again, Your Honor, this isn't courtroom procedure. Says ambush. But the judge's response was like a verdict in itself. You had access to this material and chose not to explore it. This court will not shelter oversight masquerading as strategy. That one line sucked the air out of the defense table. Diddy finally moved just slightly. He sat back, rubbed his chin once, then stared down at the table, not defeated. Not panicking, just calculating like a man trying to mentally trace the chain of events. That brought him to this exact moment, and realizing the math wasn't in his favor. The next message sealed it. It wasn't just a phrase, it was a directive, a full plan run. The sweep: kill the server, deny knowledge if it leaks, and it was dated the exact night before the federal subpoena was issued. Now the courtroom wasn't just tense, it was alive, buzzing, charged, moments away from combustion. One of the prosecutors leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and just waited like she knew this wasn't the climax, it was the warm-up. The judge glanced at the bailiff. Secure the exhibit, he said. Seal it immediately. Motion for obstruction is now on the table. Diddy looked up slowly, straight at the judge, and in that split second something passed between them. Not words, not accusations, but recognition. Diddy wasn't facing allegations anymore. It's facing the truth, and the room knew it. The room had changed, not just the tone, not just the pace, but the very atmosphere. It felt heavier, denser, like something unspoken. Now sitting in the center of the courtroom, and everyone was circling at the judge. Didn't speak again right away. He didn't have to. His eyes had done enough, and Diddy hadn't looked away. That brief stare between him and the bench had said it all, but what came next was something no one in that room expected. The prosecution didn't call a witness. They submitted a name, one name. It was typed on a single piece of paper, passed to the clerk, entered into the sealed record. Then a quiet motion was made to allow admission of corroborating evidence tied to previous sealed messages. The judge reviewed it. Took less than a minute. He nodded, and that's when the projection changed again. This time, it wasn't just messages. It was a transaction, a wire from a dummy corporation based in the Cayman Islands to a private consultant listed under an alias that had been flagged but never confirmed until now. The prosecutor read the final 4 digits of the recipient account, then turned to the jury. Those digits matched the confidential financial statements submitted last week by the defense themselves, she said. Voice steady, quiet, devastating. The same account number your team insisted didn't exist. The defense stood. Objection. Irregular, inflammatory, prejudicial. The judge simply held up a hand. Overruled. The evidence is admissible. The court has confirmed the chain of custody. At the defense table, Deed's team was unraveling in real time. Files were shuffled, phones buzzed under the desk. A junior associate reached over and whispered something directly into Diddy's ear. He didn't react, didn't nod, didn't blink, just kept staring at the screen like he was watching an avalanche fall in slow motion, and he knew there was nowhere left to run. Then the prosecutor stepped forward and said a single sentence. Your Honor, we request an immediate ink camera review for obstruction and formally request the defendant be advised of his rights under a revised charge set, and right there in front of the jury, in front of the press, stenographer, in front of a courtroom that had grown deathly still. The trap snapped shut. Diddy's face changed, not dramatically, but definitively. His jaw slackened, his posture sank, and for the first time in this entire trial, the weight wasn't something he carried, it was something that pinned him to his seat. He looked to his attorney, not with a question, but with understanding, like a man who just realized this wasn't the fight anymore, this was the fallout. And the judge. He finally leaned forward again and spoke with deliberate clarity. Mr. Combs, I'm formally notifying you that this court has sufficient basis to consider obstruction of justice charges pending full federal review. You understand? The words weren't loud, but they echoed. Diddy nodded once, slow, tired, and silent for the first Time in weeks, the courtroom didn't feel like a performance space. It felt like a holding cell. Everyone was locked into their seats. Nobody daring to move because it felt like the slightest sound might crack the entire room open the gallery had. Gone cold, the jury wasn't blinking, and did he? He looked like he had already left his body. The judge sat still, letting the silence stretch, the kind of silence that drags the truth out whether you're ready for it or not. The lead prosecutor didn't push forward. She let the room sink into itself. Her work was done for now. The evidence had spoken, the digital trail had connected, and the man who once stood untouchable was now cornered. Not by force, but by fact, Diddy's lawyer whispered something. To him, a strategy, a pivot, a possible motion. They were still trying to play chess in a game that had already ended. He didn't respond. He just sat back in his chair, hand over his mouth, eyes locked on the edge of the table, and then the judge leaned forward again. This court, he said slowly, deliberately, will now enter recess. Jurors will remain under protective instruction. Both parties will return tomorrow for preliminary review of amended charges. The gavel didn't slam, it tapped once quietly. And that soft knock carried the weight of 1,000 headlines. The courtroom buzzed, not with noise but energy. Reporters rose like shadows, already forming narratives in their minds. Some jurors shifted slightly, like they were trying to wake themselves up from what they had just witnessed. And did he? He didn't move, not until the marshals approached. They didn't cuff him, they didn't touch him, they just stood near present. That was enough. He stood slowly, not in protest, not in performance, like a man moving through something he could no longer shape. As he walked toward the side door, every eye followed him, but he didn't look back. Not once, not even as the judge remained seated, watching the entire walk like it was the final chapter of a book. He already knew the ending too, because in that moment it didn't matter what he had planned, didn't matter who he knew, what he'd built, how carefully he'd crafted the empire. The moment he realized he was trapped wasn't when they presented the evidence, it was when he understood that no one in the room was listening to the myth anymore. They were finally seeing the man, and they weren't looking away. They say you can hear truth when it finally drops, like something physical hitting the floor. That's exactly what it felt like when the courtroom emptied. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy, one step at a time. It's one breath at a time.
On gossip, but really making sure that these jurors are hearing the
time, as if no one could move too fast without risking breaking the moment apart. The jury was escorted out. A different exit than usual, 2 at a time, under watchful eyes. Reporters weren't allowed near them, but their faces said everything, some pale, some stunned. One of them had his head down, hand rubbing the back of his neck like he just walked through something radioactive inside the courthouse. Federal agents were already making calls, not about Diddy's current charges. Those were being amended. The bigger question now was, what came next? Because the evidence didn't stop with him. The digital files, the offshore trails, the name drops, the message logs, they reached beyond one man. They touched an ecosystem. Diddy wasn't just trapped in a courtroom. He was trapped inside a machine he helped build, and now it was turning back on him, back in his private holding area. He sat alone, no entourage, no lawyers, just concrete walls, and the silence he used to control with noise. There were no press agents drafting a statement, no assistants fixing optics, just him and the fact that for the first time, there were no more moves to make. He looked around that small, stale room. The walls were closer than any crowd he'd ever performed for, and it hit him not in panic, but clarity. He'd built an empire on timing, and now timing had turned its back on him. Across the city, the media was catching up. Leaks began, verified sources whispered about offshore payments, shredded NDAs, vanished staffers. One outlet published a headline in bold block. Text from mogul to marked, Diddy's empire unravels under federal scrutiny. It was no longer about his brand, no longer about his past. Now it was about survival. And even that felt uncertain. The judge's voice echoed in Diddy's head over and over again. Do you understand? He did not just the legal weight, not just the charges. He understood what it meant to lose the thing he valued most in control. Not control of a company or a case or a courtroom, but the control over the narrative, over perception, the illusion that he could always find a way out. Now he was inside a story. He didn't write, and the ending wasn't up to him anymore. The next morning arrived without mercy, a cold sky. Hung over Manhattan as black SUVs lined the courthouse alley, journalists pressed against barricades, microphones, raised cameras clicking. Even though they knew Diddy wouldn't enter through the front door, the public still hadn't heard his voice. Not since the judge confirmed new charges were being considered. Not since the evidence showed he'd crossed a line so precise, so intentional, that it stripped the courtroom of any remaining gray areas. Inside the halls of the federal building were quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that carries weight. The kind that settles on your shoulders before you even enter the courtroom. When Diddy walked in through the secured hallway, he looked different. Still dressed in sharp tailoring, yes, but stripped of presence, no air of performance, no trace of defiance, just a man walking into a room that no longer belonged to him. His hands were loosely clasped, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His team flanked him, whispering strategies and last-minute angles. But it was like none of it was reaching him because he already knew what was coming. The courtroom filled slowly, the judge entered quickly, and the moment everyone had waited for unfolded without drama. "Mr. Combs," the judge said, "tone, even this court has reviewed the materials introduced during yesterday's session, as well as the supplemental motions submitted by